sermon podcast for Sunday, the 20th of February, the second Sunday before Lent. A sermon based on the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verses 22 to 25, the stilling of the storm. I'm not very good at saying my prayers. I've never found it easy, which is why I'm grateful that most of my ministry has been punctuated by the discipline of the daily office, a call to morning and evening prayer, where I have been required to pray, often in the company of others, which itself has been an important incentive, but which has often been despite, not because of, the need and the desire to pray. In a sense, though, that makes it easier to identify those times in my life when I have felt that communication with God has been purposeful and meaningful, up close and personal. And if I'm honest, many of those times have been at moments or periods of anger or desperation when true and genuine prayer has been flung at heaven's door. Let's face it, so often our prayers can simply be a bolster for that which already keeps us distant from God. How often we think we have claims on him, that he should arrange life to meet our wishes, or maintain our enjoyments, or reward our efforts, or compensate for our pains. Once our life is reasonably well organised, we want it to stay like that, and we become agitated and disheartened when the status quo is disrupted and unexpected difficulties come along. We can become angry and confused when the cards have not continued to fall as we think they ought. And sometimes it is only at those times when a cry of desperation to the heavens, whether it be a plea for help or maybe just a hissed accusation aimed at God's heart, is when the moment of our true selves breaks through. It is surely one of the great paradoxes of prayer that sometimes it's only when our pain saddens and enslaves us, when there seems to be no defences or other prayers left, when we've tried everything but God still seems silent and distant, an experience described by R.S. Thomas in his poem Absence as a room I enter from which someone has just gone, the vestibule for the arrival of one who has not yet come. Well, it's then that it's through an anguished, expressive prayer of hurt and abandonment that it's suddenly we find we are communing deeply, personally, and genuinely with God. Prayers which ask, where is God? And why is he doing this? And why doesn't he care? Seek to do nothing more than abandon ourselves to divine providence, to throw ourselves on God's mercy, and ask nothing more than that he hears us and acknowledges us. True prayer asks no more, and ultimately that is all God seeks and desires from us. I think, therefore, this morning's Gospel of the stilling of the storm has much to teach us about prayer in the way I've tried to describe it here. What had begun, no doubt, as a smooth, untroubled crossing of the lake, so much so that Jesus had fallen asleep, quickly turns into a raging storm, where all the seafaring skills of the fishermen disciples were to no avail. And out of options, with all the cards stacked against them, They find their anger and desperation forcing them to exercise what they consider to be their last chance, to throw themselves upon Jesus' mercy, but with a prayer of anger and incredulity that Jesus could have let it get this far without seeming to care or to be engaged. Luke's version of the disciples' heartfelt plea, "Master, Master, we are perishing," is put into rich context by Mark's version, so often more blunt and to the point. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And this gospel story, interpreted in this way, finds echoes throughout the Gospels, with people at the end of their tether, in their anger and frustration, forced to rely on that final resolve or cry to God, which they find flings them back into God's arms. Think of the prodigal son at his lowest point, who realizes that there is nothing else for it but to throw himself on his father's mercy. The terrified father of his violently and dangerously possessed son, frustrated by the disciples' inability to cure him, who finally shouts his own prayer of frustration, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." The woman who breaks in on the Pharisees' meal, driven to her knees by her state of life and helplessness, to the point where there is no place for words, just an outpouring of grief and tears as she ministers to the feet of Jesus. If we can pray only when we are feeling virtuous and happy, we shall never pray at all. To recognize prayer as true dialogue is to recognize that prayer needs to address the reality of sometimes questioning God's presence and love, to recognize where people are and where they find themselves. In this day and age, I think God's heart is warmed, even if it is only to be shaken awake, because at least in the shouting, in the anger, in the shaking, there can be deep, intense, and heartfelt contact with God. Even if the disciples had not the faith to believe that despite the storm, they would be all right in the presence of Jesus, at least their prayer of anger and terror should tell us that our prayer, even if it is shouted in desperation and defiance, can reach the heart of God, so that he can say to our hearts and lives, "Peace, be still." Amen.